Hey Vsauce, Kevin here. What is momentum? Momentum really is just a vector quantity that is calculated by multiplying the mass of an object by its velocity. But importantly, who came up with this idea? And why is it used in our modern day lives? A French natural philosopher and mathematician named René Descartes first came up with the idea to describe a quantity of motion by viewing the velocity and quantity of matter conjointly. He was one of the first to acknowledge the significance of both mass and velocity to the understanding of the motion of objects. But it was Isaac Newton who, in his second law of motion, established it so in terms of momentum. F equals ma. We can reach this conclusion quite intuitively, as we know that momentum is equivalent to mass times velocity, and thus the change in momentum is the mass times the final velocity minus the mass of times the initial velocity. Now, substituting this in as the rate of change of momentum as F net, we get that F net is equal to mass times the final velocity minus the mass times the initial velocity over t. We can simplify this into mass times the final velocity minus the initial velocity over time, or F equals ma. And now to its usage. But first, in order to talk about the use of momentum, we need to introduce another idea: impulse. Impulse is essentially the change in momentum, the delta p we talked about earlier. But for our purposes, there's a more interesting way of representing impulse with force and time. If you remember earlier, impulse over time is the force. And so we can represent impulse as the area under the line of a force time graph. This graph here effectively shows how the force and time are related to impulse. But there is an interesting thing to be noticed here. Because the impulse, or the change of momentum, of an object suddenly coming to a standstill will always be the same, if the time of contact is decreased, then the maximum force acting upon the object will be greatly increased. To better illustrate what I have just said, let's try an experiment with eggs. As can be seen here, under the egg is a pillow, which collapsed as it came into contact with the egg, prolonging the time of contact and thus lessening the maximum force that would have acted upon the egg. Conversely, let's see what would have happened if there was no pillow under the egg. As can be seen here, the place where the egg landed is a hard wooden ground. This means that the floor couldn't give or collapse to allow for a longer contact time, which means that the maximum force acting on the egg will be much greater than that from the pillow. And so as a consequence, the egg that landed on the hard floor cracked and became deformed. So, now imagine a car crash. If you sat in the driver's seat of that car, would you rather that you slam your head into the driving wheel like the egg against the rock-hard ground? Or perhaps would you like a safety cushion to prolong the time of contact, to reduce the maximum force acting on your head, and perhaps even save your life? So, momentum, impulse, and their uses in everyday life to make you safer. I hope you learned something during this video, and as always, thank Thanks for watching.